Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence. On this week's episode, we talk to the curator of the National Natural History Museum of Canada, the Museum of Nature in Ottawa, Jordan Mallon, who is also a collaborator of Dave's. Hello everybody and welcome to Terrible Lizards. I am that person who knows the least about dinosaurs, apart from what Dr. Dave Hone from Queen Mary University has told me. I am Izzy Lawrence, and fortunately, just over there, we have the magnificent Dr. Dave Hone.
Hello. I mean, you don't know the least about dinosaurs. I get lots of emails from people who are able to demonstrate quite incredibly detailed how much they don't know about dinosaurs on a fairly regular basis.
Indeed, and if you want to write to Dave, you can either get to him through his website or terriblelizardspod@gmail.com, because he loves to hear your theories.
The latter is preferable if it goes to you, yes.
I particularly liked, we did a Patreon guest special last month, where one of the questions were, if dinosaurs were taken up by aliens into space, what species would they have collected and what ones would we find on other planets? Which I thought was brilliant, and you made a face. Anyway,
I did.
We're not doing any of that now though, are we, Dave?
Yeah, so today we've got Jordan Mallon on. So Jordan's an old friend of mine. He's definitely been mentioned on the pod multiple times because he and I have done a bunch of papers together, particularly on sexual dimorphism and can you tell males and females apart. And then last year, he was the lead author on the paper we did on just how big could T-Rex brackets, and in theory, everything else. It's not just about T-Rex brackets paper. So yeah, I've known him for years. We've collaborated on loads of stuff. He does lots and lots of really cool research on top of the stuff he does with me, which is of course cool as well, because I can just see him preparing to interject and go, yeah, my stuff's cool, but when you drag me down, it's not as good. And also that's
how I feel. Yeah,
and he's the curator at, I can't remember his official name, but I think it's the National Museum of Canada in Ottawa. So we had Rebecca Hunt Foster on last time out talking about Dinosaur National Monument. Jordan's also a curator, but at a very different institute, a much more traditional natural history museum and its dinosaur and paleo collection. So here he is. Welcome, Dr. Jordan Mallon.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hone, for having me. And I will say off the bat, it is the Canadian Museum of Nature.
Yes, I realized once I'd started I couldn't remember its exact name, but it is effectively the National Museum, correct?
That's right, yeah. And we've gone through a few name changes. The museum's well over 100 years old, so we've had a few name changes over the years, so this is just the latest one.
I do want to start kind of with a more basic background on you. So how did you get into paleo/dinosaurs and then even into the museum, because jobs like yours don't come around every day. They are a kind of one in a lifetime dead man's shoes type position.
I was bitten by the dinosaur bug early, I suppose you could say, just like many of us. Yeah, over the years, I wanted to do various things as a kid. I wanted to be a comic book artist. I was very sort of artistically inclined. I wanted to be I'm Canadian, so I wanted to be a hockey player. I grew up playing hockey. But all the while I had an interest in dinosaurs, and I stayed on the straight and narrow, I think, for various reasons, collecting fossils locally at the caves here, the Bonnechere Caves. Growing up, I saw Jurassic Park like just about everyone my age at a young age. I grew up going to the museum where I work now, which is the Canadian Museum of Nature. So all those little things kind of kept me on the path of paleo, and I stuck with it through primary school, high school, and in through university. So that's kind of how I got into dinosaurs anyways.
So when you're into dinosaurs, though, that doesn't always translate to a job in paleontology. So how? That's what people want to know. You've got a lot of undergraduates who listen to this who are all doing either biology or geology degrees, and they're thinking, how on earth do I get into it? So how did you manage to fall into the career that you have, or work very hard, not fall into? That's what I meant to say.
Well, it's a bit of both, Izzy. I always tell my own students this. You can control. There's two aspects of getting into the field of paleo, one of which you can control and the other you can't. You can't control when the job openings are going to be available. That's out of your hands, but you can control the fact that you are the best position for the job when it does become available if you work hard. And in my case, well, as I said, I grew up going to the Canadian Museum of Nature where I am now, and I volunteered there quite a bit as a high school student, and so I got to know everyone around the museum pretty well. I did my undergraduate schooling at Carleton University, which is here in Ottawa. When I was entering university, I got they had an open house at Carleton, and I got speaking to one of the geology profs there, who told me, "Oh, well, you're coming along at a good time because we happen to have a paleontology program about to start." But it's all the timing that I couldn't control. But I was the first one into that program, along with my colleague Nick Campione, who also went to become a paleontologist. So I did my undergraduate degree at Carleton, got an honors degree in paleo, and then went and did my doctoral work at the University of Calgary. Having got my diploma, it just so happened that as I was graduating, there had been a recent retirement at the Canadian Museum of Nature, Dr. Steve Kumba,
Nice.
a great colleague of mine. Yeah, they decided to use his salary money to fund a postdoc for a couple of years, because they didn't really know if they wanted to backfill that position or not. But they used some of that salary money for a postdoc, which I was able to apply for and got. And yeah, was eventually able to land the permanent position too, which eventually came along a year or two later. It's a little bit of talent, sure, but it's also a lot of luck, which I'm grateful for every day.
What's your role within the museum then? What is it that you're? Are you a curator? Is this your thing? Are you putting on exhibitions, or do you do research? What's your thing?
I do research. So my official title at the museum is a research scientist in paleobiology. So Dave mentioned I was a curator earlier. Technically, I guess that's not true, because that's not the technical name of my position. But I do the work that a curator does by and large. But it's a little different at my museum anyways, because we distinguish between curators and research scientists. So at most museums, a curator will do both research and curate a collection. They're effectively a collections manager. They do both. At my museum, we have collections managers, which we call curators, and we have research scientists, which is what I do. So I don't do a lot of the collections management side. I mean, I am involved if, I can advise on what needs to be properly cared for or whatnot, but I don't handle the ins and outs of that. I focus primarily on research, and I've got students and whatnot.
You don't make the little labels.
Thankfully, we have someone else to do that. Yeah, I did make the little labels once upon a time.
Did you?
Again, yeah, when I volunteered.
That seems just such a horrible thing to have to write, because usually every single object in a museum is so complicated and there's so many dynamics to it, and you have to basically go 50 words, explain why this is important, and nobody reads it anyway, and you must sort of bleed over it. I wouldn't like to do that.
Well, the world is full of many different people, and some people have talents in areas that I am not. I'm not particularly adept at puzzling broken up fossils together. We've got other people who do that at the museum, and they're great at it. They've got the patience. I don't have the patience for it, so God bless them.
I know that obviously Dave's already mentioned some of the papers that you've written with him, but should we look at what you haven't done with him?
Yeah, I research many different things. I guess my main areas of interest are in horned dinosaurs. I do a lot of work on horned dinosaurs. That stems from my undergraduate project that I did. I sort of got the bug way back when. But I also work a lot on questions related to dinosaur ecology, which stem from my dissertation work. So questions about dinosaur feeding and, how did these animals get along with one another, or maybe didn't get along with one another. I really like to think about dinosaurs as living animals. I say this a lot. I'm not so much interested in dinosaur, relationships, although it's a necessary evil that must be broached, and I have my hand in that too. But I'm not so much interested in dinosaur extinction, although, again, that's an important question. But I like to imagine dinosaurs as they once were. And so that's why I think ecology dinosaur ecology is something that really fascinates me.
I want to start with the horned dinosaurs because that's an interesting distinction from my perspective anyway. Is that how you can categorize? You can lump dinosaurs together as the ones with the horns. In my head, that'll be all the herbivores, or are there carnivores with... I mean, because they've got crests. I know tyrannosaurs and stuff have crests, but they don't count as horns, do they? What counts as a horn?
Well, horn has, well, actually, it doesn't really have a good definition. Many people call horns by different things, but typically when I use the word horn in the sense of horned dinosaurs, I mean, Triceratops and its ilk. So animals with a bony horn core that's overlaid with a keratinous sheath. Again, these are the really familiar things to us as dinosaur lovers: Triceratops, Styracosaurus, and their non-horned ancestors, Protoceratops and Psittacosaurus and Ceratopsia, we call them.
What are the uniting features of all of these? Because presumably this is, what does Dave call it? He calls it, doesn't call it convergent evolution. What is it when you have things that basically evolve the same things but separately at the same sort of time? Is that where horns come from? Or are they all related? Do they all come from one sort of genetic line?
Yeah, I think homology is the word you're looking for, maybe.
Boom! That sounds like a proper word, doesn't it?
Yeah, as far as we know, all the horns in horned dinosaurs are all homologous. The frills have little blips and doodads that are horn-like that we debate over the homology of those things. But as far as the really distinctive facial horns on, Triceratops and Chasmosaurus, you got two over the eyes, one over the nose, and those may or may not be well expressed. Sometimes they're not expressed at all, but I think it's safe to say, I think most horned dinosaur researchers would agree that those are homologous, which is to say that they are inherited from a common ancestor.
The other thing is the kind of, they're not horns in that they probably weren't, they didn't have a sheath on them, but there are these jugal bosses, so these big cheek spikes, and those turn up in even the very earliest of the horned dinosaurs. So actually that was probably what they started with. And those are still present in things like Triceratops. You just don't see them anything like as much because it's impossible not to ignore the much, much bigger horns. But actually the jugal bosses are probably a clearer feature that is present in even the really, really old ones and goes all the way through the lineage.
I won't argue with that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, those jugal horns evolved quite early. You see them in things like Psittacosaurus, which is a very early diverging horned dinosaur. Those are about the only horns those things have. But they've got other things that relate them to the later ceratopsids with the big horns, things like a rostral beak. So they've got this extra bone on the tip of the beak called the rostral bone. And you see that in Triceratops and its ilk, and you also see that in Psittacosaurus, Protoceratops, which are features that would link the earlier with the later forms.
Your early dissertation was based on these horned dinosaurs. Did you come to any sort of conclusions that, I can just drop in a dinner conversation and sound like I know what I'm talking about?
Well, actually, this is early work that Dave and I came to be involved in. Because that research, this was my honors thesis, looked at what were meant to be male and female, originally described as male and female, of a dinosaur called Chasmosaurus belli. My predecessor at the museum, Charlie Sternberg, collected a couple of Chasmosaurus skeletons back in the 1910s. And they looked, for all intents and purposes, very alike, except one had slightly more gracile bones than the other, and they varied in some subtle ways in the frills as well. And Sternberg thought that this was just male and female of the same species, which kudos to him, because sexual dimorphism isn't something that they thought about a lot back then. And so the purpose of my honors thesis was to go back and look at those specimens and to do some research on them, quantify the differences between them, which included where they occur in the rock record. And I was able to show that, in fact, they don't overlap in time whatsoever. One individual was from much lower in the rock record than the other. And so the likelihood that they were male and female of the same species was was slight, let's just say. And so, yeah, that really got me interested in this question about what is sexual dimorphism and how do you identify it in the fossil record, which is something that, Dave's been very interested in over the years too. And we've been able to collaborate on those questions.
So the stereotypes are obviously that, the boys are going to be, well, for mammals, but the boys are going to be bigger with the horns and the display and all of that sort of thing. And the females are going to be brown and boring and smaller. But obviously in birds, females tend to be bigger, particularly in predatory birds. So what is the stereotype and what have you come to sort of find out about the truth to that stereotype?
Well, as far as what was the bigger of the two sexes in dinosaurs, we really don't know. In fact, the research that Dave and I have done has shown that it's actually very difficult to demonstrate any kind of sexual dimorphism in the dinosaur fossil record for various reasons, having to do with, statistical sample size, having to do with being able to control for all the sort of extraneous factors like age is a really big one. Being able to control for all those different factors is just something you can't typically do with the dinosaur fossil record. And for that reason, I would argue that we've really done a poor job of demonstrating, of being able to tease apart the males from the females in the dinosaur fossil record. Some people have recently come back and argued otherwise with new evidence, and I'm happy to accept that insofar as it goes. Maybe they're right. I really do think dinosaurs must have been sexually dimorphic, but it's just been so hard to show to date. So yeah, Dave, do you want to chime in now on that?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly it. Is that when I wrote my paper on mutual sexual selection, I was basically arguing that dimorphism probably isn't out there. I'd now shift that position largely off the work that we've done and say it's probably out there. We just can't see it. Though I still think that mutual sexual selection is probably pretty important, because otherwise you would be seeing things like the ceratopsians where there would be horned and hornless versions, and we're just not seeing that. So even in things like there was a paper on Stegosaurus suggesting actually Stegosaurus is dimorphic when we said it probably wasn't. Even if that's the case, that's not a Stegosaurus as we traditionally think of it is the male, and there's this plateless, spikeless female version. It's still a plated and spiked Stegosaurus that looks a bit different from the other one. So even if that is the case, there's still, to a fairly large degree, a version of mutual sexual selection if that's sociosexual display and conflict. So again, it's not even a binary thing there. There are degrees and degrees. And again, that actually matches with what we see with modern species. There are things under mutual sexual selection where males and females are both ornamented and both signaling to each other, but males on average are still bigger animals with bigger crests. It's just way more subtle than the traditional lion or peacock or whatever, classic example people usually think of. But yeah, our work in particular on sample size, we reckon there's 2 or 3 species worldwide you could currently do this on, because the sample size is so dreadful.
And I mean, even if you do get an amazing sample size, they might not all be
dimorphic,
preserved in the same way. Well, I'm saying they might not be preserved in the same way, in which case, you got one preserved in dorsal view, you got one preserved in lateral view. And then it's like, well, I guess it is a sample size thing, because your sample size goes down again as a result. But yeah, there's so many complicating factors that are frustrating.
Let's talk about sexual dimorphism anyway. I mean, what are the advantages? I mean, why is there sexual dimorphism, and what does it tell us about a species when they show this? Because some obviously species have very slight sexual dimorphism, some you can't even notice at all. What are the driving forces behind that, and why is it an advantage for certain species to do it and others to not? What does it tell us about the way that they live?
Dave, I think you'd be even better to answer that.
I was going to say, we're interviewing Jordan, but I'll have a go. I mean, the really short line is it's degrees of investment. So where males have low investment in the offspring and females have very high investment in the offspring, males are entering a system which is rewarding them for being very showy to attract more mating opportunities and the chance of having more kids, while the females are using that to basically find who is the best male to get the healthiest genes for their offspring. Think of peacocks. On the other hand, if you go to the opposite extreme with something like penguins, well, females can't rear a chick on their own. That standing on the ice for months at a time and trekking out, and I'm thinking of emperor penguins, trekking to the sea, getting sufficient, coming back a week later, you need both parents and they're both putting in tons of effort. So if that's the case, males will do very badly if they go for a giant showy thing and try and mate with as many females as possible if they can't look after any of the offspring. So now they're in a system where, hang on, I need to do every bit as much work as I need her to do. So it's in my interest to get a good female as well as it's in her interest to get a good mate. And that's the really big split. On top of that, when it comes to reptiles and at least some birds, big females have more eggs or bigger eggs. So that can be a driver as well. My suspicion is that's probably not operating in dinosaurs very much because they're so much bigger than the eggs that they're laying. But yeah, if you can show that males and females are highly dimorphic or completely monomorphic, they're virtually the same, that really tells you something about their mating system and how they're operating and potential social interactions, but in particular reproduction and rearing.
Layer in, mate competition too, and that's going to select for probably larger males in most cases too, or fighting one another for access to females, and it's a complex question.
So when you have ornamented or particularly armed females, so things like duiker, these small antelope, they defend territory in pairs. So males and females are equally ornamented, less about that classic bit of selection we just talked about and more about them both operating together to chase off other male and female pairs that might encroach on their territory. But again, it shows you something about their reproductive output and it shows you something about their social behavior.
Now, I remember this from an early episode that I did with Dave, and I've kind of forgotten the name, but I'm going to say what I think the name is, and then you can laugh at me. But I believe that you can tell that a dinosaur is female, usually because of the presence of medullary bone. Is that what I'm remembering right? Medullary?
Yes. Or medullary. I've heard both. Tomato, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, this is a type of bone that occurs inside, all throughout the skeleton. But I'm thinking we look for it typically in the long bones of any animal, really, or a bird. This type of bone doesn't occur across many different animals, but it certainly occurs in birds, and it occurs in dinosaurs as well. And this is basically a calcium deposit that's used to draw from when the eggs are being shelled. And it's been identified in a few dinosaur types now. So it's pretty widespread, we think, throughout dinosaurs and birds. I think it's even been found in crocodilians too.
Yeah, I thought it was in at least a couple of crocs. So yeah, it's probably an Archosaur thing.
Exactly. Yeah. As I say, it's hard to identify the boys from the girls as far as the looking at, say, size in dinosaurs, size distribution. But when you've got that medullary bone or medullary bone, you've at least got a gravid female that's laying eggs. And if you don't see it, you might just have a male, or you might have a female that's not laying eggs. So its absence doesn't tell you anything, but its presence is unmistakable.
I think what we'd really, really want for a truly convincing case of dimorphism is one of those mass mortality sites from somewhere like Mongolia. And we have stuff like this where there's maybe 15, 20 animals of something like an oviraptorosaur where we already suspect there might be sexual dimorphism, and there's been a couple of papers about that. And then when we cut them up, 7 of the 15 have medullary bone, and they're all the ones that have smaller crests or have a different tail articulation, because the idea with these guys is they have these flappy mini peacock tails. And then it's going to be really pretty hard to argue against. This must have been peak breeding season if all these different animals are all showing medullary bone at exactly the same time. And then you've got a fairly clear anatomical split between group A and group B, even at different sizes, because you'll have little males and big females. So if we ever found something like that, I think it would be a nailed-on case, even though it would be well below the statistical threshold that Jordan and I argued for, because you've just got all the data that you'd want to be able to demonstrate this. But basically, until we have something like that, unless you have some massive data set that's really strong, we argued you're just not going to find it. And again, that's part of the problem, is that we said you need, I think our analysis was 60 animals, but that also needs to be a fairly even split between males and females, which of course may not be the case because populations vary and all the rest of it. And that assumes they're quite sexually dimorphic, because we tested this on alligators, which are heavily dimorphic, and lots of other reptiles, it's like a 10% body difference. Well, to pick that up, you need a data set of 200 animals, and we don't have there isn't one. Maybe there is a Psittacosaurus. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of specimens of Psittacosaurus, but their taxonomy is a mess, and loads of them have been dug up randomly, and no one actually knows where they came from. So actually getting a decent data set out of that probably still isn't possible.
Or they're squished flat.
Yeah, so it really is this massive challenge that it's, you've got all these factors going in, and that assumes that it's present to a high degree. And of course, as you say, there's stuff like peacocks, but there's stuff like crows and magpies, but the penguin argument I always give, famously, at least some penguins don't be able to tell male from female of their own species. So if penguins are struggling to tell male and female penguins apart, it shouldn't be a shock that we're struggling.
Stay tuned, come back in 100 years and ask again.
Yeah. I mean, same with the T-Rex stuff, where we're projecting that of give it another half century and we might have found a bigger one.
That was a fun paper. I think the work that we did there showed that if there is dimorphism in T-Rex, at least strongly expressed dimorphism, we would have seen it by now. And so if T-Rex was dimorphic, at least in the in the skeletal proportions, because of course it could well be they were strongly dimorphic in color, and we just have no idea about that. But if you're looking at the skeleton, if there are differences there between the males and the females, they're subtle.
Let's talk a little more about the museum. So just how big is it? Because I think a lot of people who've been to a big natural history museum in Canada have been to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, or of course, if they're a dinosaur nerd, they've been up to the Royal Tyrrell Museum. And Ottawa's not a tiny city, but it's also neither of those places. So tell us a bit about the museum.
Well, we are the Canadian Museum of Nature, as I say. We house something on the order of 10 million specimens. We're Canada's national natural history museum, somewhat like the Smithsonian in the U.S., only we are much, much smaller than they are. But yeah, the museum was originally the Museum of the Geological Survey of Canada, which got its start in Montreal in the 1850s, 60s, something like that. And the survey moved to Ottawa in the 70s, began to grow as there was an active, field program of geologists going out and mapping, mapping the West primarily. And people like by the name of Dawson and Weston and McCune, these were all natural historians, and in the act of exploring the West, they happened to find some dinosaur fossils, which fit in the palm of your hand, not much to speak of. But by the 1910s, the museum really got involved in dinosaur collecting through the Sternberg family. Barnum Brown at the American Museum of Natural History in New York had just come up to Alberta and was successfully finding many dinosaurs in the Albertan Badlands on the Red Deer River. The Geological Survey caught wind of this, but rather than pass a law to prevent the Americans from coming up and stealing our fossils or whatever, we thought, well, why don't we make a friendly competition out of it? And so we had no trained field paleontologists at the time. And so we hired the Sternberg family to come up from Kansas. They were seasoned professionals in fossil collecting. And they came up and collected most of the dinosaurs that are in our collections now. And so, yeah, that's really how at least the dinosaur side of the museum got its birth, was through the Sternberg family. And you mentioned, Dave, when you think of Canada and dinosaurs, you often think of Brom, you often think of the Tyrrell Museum. Yeah. But what I like working at the Canadian Museum of Nature is because we are such a historical institution, we actually have the most dinosaur holotypes in Canada.
Yeah, I can imagine.
more so than either of those places. We've got the holotype of Chasmosaurus and Gripposaurus, Edmontosaurus regalis. We got the holotype of Euoplocephalus, Styracosaurus, all these classic dinosaurs.
All the ones that aren't in the American Museum of Natural History.
Well, they've got, the type of Saurolophus and Corythosaurus, but Barnum Brown wasn't as active in the Badlands as the Sternbergs were. He was kind of in and out in a few years, but the Sternberg stayed on for a long time, and as a result, amassed a massive collection of dinosaurs, many of which were the first of their kind. So that's the one, piece I like to hammer home, is just the number of holotypes that we have.
But that's also, just where I was edging to in my question is that, you are not as well known as those other places, but it also then means you're underappreciated, I think, by, kind of Joe Public, who will naturally gravitate towards the big places that have the kind of reputation. But yeah, when I did visit you, was it 6-7 years ago, that was a very happy time in those collections, seeing an awful lot of very, very cool stuff. And not just the dinosaurs as well. So something we would never normally touch on, but it's one of those handfuls of fossils which has, I think, like transcended paleo nerdery and reached the general public. You've got the holotype of Tiktaalik.
Yes, we do. Yeah, that and technically it's not.
Yeah,
it's
the held museum. With you.
Yeah. So Tiktaalik's from Nunavut up in northern Canada, and technically belongs to the territory of Nunavut. Only they don't have a museum up there. And so we get, they basically pay us, the territory does, to curate Tiktaalik and their fossil collection. So we have a small fossil collection from Nunavut, and that includes the fishapod Tiktaalik. Yeah.
I want to know, for our listeners, describe what a Tiktaalik is.
A Tiktaalik is a fish with 4 legs, I guess you could say. Or yeah, it's one of these early tetrapod sort of ancestors, and it looks for all the world like a fish, and its fins have begun to grow into legs. So if you look carefully at the anatomy, you can see it's got a rudimentary upper arm bone, a humerus, it's got a radius and ulna, and the fin rays are starting to become reduced and look a bit more like fingers. So it's fascinating specimen. And really important, for a lot of paleontologists, it's sort of like the Mona Lisa, on par with, Archaeopteryx in Berlin or something like that. So
yeah, I mean, it's literally in that handful of specimens like Sue, the Berlin Archaeopteryx. I would put Tiktaalik up there, something like Lucy, this absolute handful of specimens that not everyone would recognize, but if I surveyed 10,000 people and showed them 100 different fossils, these might, or named them, these would be near the top of the list that they'd actually be able to pick out of, that's the thing I've actually heard of that I know is important. As an individual, not like Diplodocus or T-Rex as a species, but like that one. And yeah, that specimen of Tiktaalik, that was one of those rare moments for someone like me going, oh wow, I've got to see that. Because it's hard to explain to, I think, actually, it's probably easier to explain to non-experts. So, like, for example, I see online a lot, people are regularly posting like, oh my God, I finally got to see Sue, I finally got to go to the Field Museum and I finally got to see Sue. Wow, I've wanted this my whole life. Wow, what an experience. And me, when I saw Sue, I went, oh, that's cool. It's like the 7th T-Rex I've seen, and I spent days working on skeletons before. It's cool, but But yeah, seeing Tiktaalik was like, wow, this is a thing that like means something to me. And that's for someone who doesn't work on anything like that transition, and it's way out my time zone and way out my phylogenetic interest. So yeah, that level of thing that I think an awful lot of our listeners get every time they go to a museum. For me, bored old jaded paleontologist who's seen thousands of these things in every museum, Tiktaalik was special.
I got a couple of questions about Tiktaalik. The first one is, when were they digging in Nunavut? Because all I know about Nunavut is it's quite far north, as in pretty far north, got a very low population, and there are narwhals there. I know that. And I wasn't aware that there was much paleontology going on there. So when and how was it discovered? And then also, is this a case of, do we think an ancestor, or is this just a sort of like a cousin of the animals that eventually came out and then bred on? Is there any way of knowing whether this is actually a direct ancestor of the first fish that became land animals?
Well, I'll tell you, you're kind of asking the wrong guy, because I wasn't there to collect it. This would have been collected I think in the early 2000s by Neil Shubin and his team, thereabouts. And they went up there specifically to look for early tetrapod ancestors. There were rocks there of the right age and the right type to possibly host those tetrapod ancestors. And my understanding is they went looking there and they sort of found what they expected to find.
Wow.
And as far as whether that thing is the ancestral, tetrapod, almost certainly not. It's really hard to know that we have found the common ancestor of, all these living tetrapods and whatnot. But it seems like it's a dead ringer, and so
it could be.
It could be. Yeah, it's close. Put it that way.
Yeah, it's definitely right among those little branches that are starting to branch off. So it's very unlikely to be the ancestor, but it's close enough that it will tell you a hell of a lot about what that might have looked like and what evolutionary pressures were going on that was pushing these animals out of the water and onto the land. And so
it's a close approximation, we'll say.
Yeah.
I do love, though, that the science behind it. So this wasn't a case of people just go, oh, this looks like a strange rock, what's in it? But it's literally like, we know roughly when fish had to come out of the water in terms of evolutionary time, and we know where we can find those rocks. Let's go there and see what we can find. And they found it. It's that sort of logic it's just beautiful in terms of a non-scientist's mind to just go, oh, you can do that. That's cool.
It's pretty common though. I mean, we've been asked several times, like, how do you know where to look? And it's like at a footprint level, when you're in the field, you just kind of look everywhere, or you look below this level, or look above this level, or try and stick to this area. But yeah, we're not at the point of geological history or scientific history where we're just setting out across the prairie and hoping we'll come across dinosaurs. You're like, the world has been mapped geologically. You've got a pretty good idea of where to go most of the time.
I remember as an undergraduate, one of my I think he was my geochemistry prof, something like that, geophysics prof, I think. He always used to say, he knew there was a few of us in the new, paleontology program, and he always used to sort of chide us, saying, you're just a bunch of stamp collectors. There's no science in paleontology. You're just weaving your baskets or whatever. But that's science in action, as you say. Is you've got a paradigm, you've got a model that you're working with, a hypothesis, and you test it by going to the field and looking for the predictions that stem from that hypothesis. And if you find it, great, you've supported the hypothesis. But that's hypothesis testing. That's science. Just him saying that always stuck in my craw.
To be fair, some of the stuff that we've criticized, there's there are issues. It's not always as
there are, and paleontology isn't physics, and it's not math. There's certainly room for
interpretation,
imagination and interpretation, and that's my favorite part about paleontology. I got my foot in the door in paleo. It wasn't so much through the science, but through the art. I loved paleo art. I loved creating paleo art. I wish I still had the time to do that kind of stuff, but I just don't. And I think paleo attracts a lot of artistically minded people for that reason, because there's the science side, but there's also room to bring in your imagination. You have to imagine these things as they once were, and we don't know everything there is to know about dinosaurs, and so you fill in the holes with your imagination, and I think that's what makes it so much fun, at least for me.
I mean the number of paleontologists who are qualified academics who can properly draw, unlike my scribblings, is really quite high. I doubt that exists in physics and chemistry and maths or anything like that. And, you showed me some of your stuff, and it's good. And on the subject of paleo art and your collection, so again, you showed me a bunch of Bob Backer's original drawings. How on earth did the museum end up with them? Because he's not like he's famous for going to Ottawa to draw stuff.
I kind of had the same questions myself when I first came across that stuff. So that artwork was featured in the last iteration of our fossil gallery. So our new fossil gallery, well, new quote unquote, was opened in 2006. So it's due for a refresh now. But the gallery before that opened in 1970. This was designed by people like Dale Russell, my predecessor at the museum, and Dick Harrington, who was a mammal paleontologist. And Dale, in the late 60s, was in correspondence with a young undergraduate by the name of Bob Bacher. And Bob was very artistically inclined, yet another paleo artist. I found some old correspondence in our archives from Dale contracting several images from Bob for display on the information panels next to the skeletons in the old version of the gallery. So those big art pieces you're referring to, they're just black and white sort of pencil drawings. But those were printed onto those panels. But we still have the originals, and they're fantastic pieces of art. We've got quite a bit of art. Ellie Kish is another famous artist who did a lot of work with Dale Russell. She did full-scale paintings, which we have in our archives as well. That's kind of the joy about working at a museum with so much history behind it, is you can sort of root through the archives and find all kinds of goodies like that. So. And maybe after I retire, after I'm done my research, I'd love to just spend all my time in archives, just trawling through it and seeing what kind of goodies I can come up with.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, again, trying to draw those parallels between how different like a classic museum is to something like Rebecca talked about with us in the last episode is. Yeah, they do have a collection with draws of stuff, but fundamentally that is the big thing, because you're effectively two separate entities as well, aren't you? So you've got like the public display museum in the center of town, and then where you mostly work, which is like the archive and curated like warehouse and offices that's full of fossils and stuff, right?
That's right. Yeah, our galleries are in what is the Victoria Memorial Museum building, which is we call it the castle, because it looks for all the world like a castle, which is in downtown Ottawa. But it's limited in size, and it's built up all around it now, and so there's no room, and there hasn't been room for decades for the museum to be able to expand for that reason. And so. I don't know what year it was. It must have been in maybe the 30s or 40s. The collections outgrew the building. And at one point, the museum collections were distributed over a dozen buildings throughout Ottawa. And, which has its downsides, of course. Makes it very hard to get the staff together. And, I hear stories about some people worked together for 20 years and never saw one another because they were never in the same building. And so in the mid-90s, 1996, the museum purchased a piece of land across the river in Gatineau, Quebec, and built a new collections so that we could house all the 12 buildings worth of material back under a single roof. And so it spans like several NHL hockey rinks. I know.
Thank you for mentioning hockey. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning hockey. That's completed. That's a bow. That is.
I knew you'd appreciate that. However many football fields, I don't know. Figure it out. Do the conversion. And so everything's back under one roof again. And the only downside, it's an amazing building. We've got great climate control and pest control and all the rest of it. The fossils are very well maintained, and as well as all the other collections. But because it's sort of hidden away on the other side of the river, a lot of people don't appreciate that we are an active research institution. The visitors come, to the galleries downtown Ottawa. They see the galleries, but they don't see, the behind the scenes. They don't see the researchers there. It's got its ups and its downs, but it's a great place to work. Absolutely.
So what are you researching other than, just helping Dave with his silly little papers? What are you working on?
Well, when I'm not holding Dave's hand,
I love this episode.
I only tease the people that I love. Right now, I've got various things on the go. I've got a lot of student-led projects. So I'm an adjunct research professor at Carleton University, which I mentioned I attended in my undergraduate days. So I have students who are now in the same program that I came up through, which is great. And so I'm supervising a lot of their projects. I got a student, Brian, right now. He was a former student of mine, but he's just finishing writing up his master's research describing the first skeleton of a baby pachycephalosaur, which is going to be really fun when that comes out. Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. It's I won't say too much about it. It's missing. I'll say it's missing a head, unfortunately.
How this is the opposite to sauropod problem, which we've discussed, which sauropods consist entirely of postcranial material, and now you've got the postcranial without the one thing that we're used to having for these animals.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's strange, and actually, I have a pretty good site description, and I've tried relocating that quarry some years ago to see if maybe we could find the skull, but we couldn't find it. I've since found a few more clues as to where it might be, so I'm going to try again this summer to find that. But anyways, that research is forthcoming. That's in review right now. That'll be, well, it won't be big news when it comes out, but it'll be, the dinosaur lovers will appreciate it, I'm sure. Research on horned dinosaurs, I mentioned earlier, Izzy, giving some old animals some new names, researching, I've got another student of mine who just graduated, Josh, looking at tooth isotopes in duck-billed dinosaurs and what that tells us about, how they were living on the landscape and what they were eating. And that's going to be some pretty cool research when it comes out too. So yeah, I've always got lots on the go. Dave and I have a couple of book chapters. Well, we've got one book chapter. I've got a separate book chapter that's been in press for ages now and waiting.
Yeah, no, I know. And everyone else. Yeah. Have you ever considered working on pterosaurs? I mean, pteranodons out there.
Yeah, so I heard. Yeah. we do have one good pterosaur at the museum. We're hardly known for our pterosaur collections. Pterosaurs are very hard to come by in Canada. In fact, like Dave's named just about the only one, I think. But we do have a really nice pteranodon from Kansas that as I'm told by Dave, it's one of the most complete. And so he and I have been batting that project around for a while. Eventually, we'll get that to flap its wings and take off. We've got some collaborators who are also involved, so that's kind of slowing things up. But,
so it's their fault, is what we're saying.
Hey, I'm not the pterosaur guy, so I take no responsibility. It'll happen. Just you wait.
Oh yeah, no, I don't. I guess another question, kind of going back to the museum is, you said the main galleries are ripe for renovation, or at least that's what you want. And I think that's probably the case in most museums. Unless you've just finished a 5-year renovation of something, I think most people look at their collection or exhibition space and are always like, yeah, that's not quite right. And that's changed since then. And now we've got a couple more of them. But is that something that's kind of on the cards, as in is there process at the museum where in the next few years this is moving to the top of the agenda?
Yes, is my understanding. There's no date set yet, but everyone's aware that the refresh is due.
So before you retire, it might.
Yeah, well, in all likelihood, I will only be involved in the development of one gallery, and it's unlikely to turn over twice in my lifetime. But I've not had that opportunity, and I know those who have had that opportunity. Once it's done, they're glad it is done. It's a big job, obviously, but I've certainly thought a bit about it. There are some mounts I would like to see that I've never seen attempted before, and if I had my druthers and if money were not limiting, You'll see maybe a rearing Chasmosaurus one day when you come in the front doors. That classic painting by Gregory Paul,
wasn't it? Yeah.
Rearing Chasmosaurus. I love that. I love that illustration. If I could mount that, that would put a smile on my face. And we've got 2 Chasmosaurus skeletons, so let's mount one of them.
Right, and then you can have that dynamic of it coming down on the other or something. So
yeah. That would be my dream come true, I think.
For any billionaires listening, we've got a use for all that income. We go.
It's frustrating being in Ottawa sometimes because, you go down to Toronto, there's a lot of private money there. There's a lot of, there's all kinds of different businesses that operate out of Toronto. They have their headquarters there. So there's lots of private money and they can invest in museums. There's a lot of old family money kicking around down there. You don't have that in Ottawa. Ottawa, being the capital of Canada, is a government town. And
the government doesn't like spending money.
Well, the private individuals don't like spending money. We're not a rich town by any means. We don't have business here the way Montreal or Vancouver does, or Toronto, and very often, because we're largely subsidized by the federal government, the thinking is, well, you already get my tax money anyways, why would I give you more? So we kind of get by on the baseline operations and have a hard time getting beyond that, it seems. So I can't complain in the sense that there's always money there to be used, but you can't use it in any way you would like. So
I made a pitch once in a Guardian article years ago that paleontology should get all of the world's research money, because if you want to build a new telescope to look at the galaxy's still going to be there in 100 years. You want to build a Large Hadron Collider for the Higgs boson, it will or won't be there in 100 years. But in 100 years, God knows what will have eroded and will never exist again. So actually, give us all the money. We'll go and dig up everything, and then the money can go back to the other fields of research. So that was my pitch, and I think that's a still reasonable position. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I see no flaws in that reasoning. Sure.
Children will still be dying of cancer in 100 years. There's no need to help them.
That wasn't. I was thinking more of that. That's applied sciences, and I'm talking about classic primary research. I did not suggest that we wouldn't fund medicine. I remember actually many years ago now when they were building or started to open up the Large Hadron Collider, and they were announcing the cost of it. And Ollie Rauhut, I was in Munich at the time, and I did some back of the envelope calculations, and we reckoned the annual running cost was the same as all of the grant income in Europe for vertebrate paleontology at that time. So it's the running cost of this one building could fund an entire field in Europe. And it's that does seem a bit imbalanced, particularly when some of those grants will run for years or decades as well. So
in my case, we don't even have a full-time preparator at my museum. We have contract preparators, but we've got decades and decades and decades worth of backlog to still prep. Holotype skeletons, the type skeleton of Griposaurus still has been prepped, and it's going to be a multi-year job. But when you've only got a preparator for a year or two at a time, you're not able to get those jobs done.
When AI does all the other jobs, then we can get in. Everybody else can just spend their time scraping away bits of stone from other bits of stone and making all the dinosaur fossils pretty.
I'm sure that's up somebody's alley. Not mine, but I'm sure it's up someone's alley.
I think quite a few of our listeners are desperate to get into. We've had a few emails from people just going, is it possible just to go and volunteer at a museum and they give you a chisel? Not really.
The answer is sort of. It depends where. I mean, but there are absolutely volunteer preparators in various places, but obviously you
not on
don't
holotypes.
Start on dinosaur types in the National Museum.
It's some museums are able to make it work. Some we have a hard time making that work because For one, again, our museum collections are out in the boonies on the other side of the river. And so a lot of people don't even know we're there, A. And B, it's hard for students, especially students, to get to, because if they don't have a car of their own, we're not easily accessible by public transit. We have had students on and off do some prep. Their schedules always change every few months too, as the semester changes. So you can't give them big projects to work on because you're not going to see them probably 3 months from now, and they're not able to maintain that work. And then you're left with a half-finished project, and not to mention all the training time that it takes into training up someone properly. So it's easier said than done.
I've only touched at the edges of that, but yeah, I know, even with like occasional undergrads who want to do stuff with me, and then you spend a few weeks trying to get them up to speed, and then they're like, this isn't for me, which is fine. But it's like, right, but if I spent the time I spent trying to teach you how to do it, just doing it myself, it might be done by now. And instead I haven't done it and you're not doing it. And once you've done that 3 or 4 times, you really run out of enthusiasm for doing it. So you'd already need like a proper prep lab with 3 or 4 preparators who are in that position to give that time up. Because for, 4 out of 5 might drop out, but the one who doesn't goes on to be spectacular. But that's then very, very hard. Yeah, if you're then stuck with contractors in the first place. So it's really hard to get like the culture embedded.
It's difficult to keep it self-sustaining. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly that. Well, thank you so much for coming on, mate. It's been really good. You, as I say, you're one of the, maybe there are more out there, but I know of only literally a very small handful of actual dinosaur academics who listen to this show, which tells you the scope that it reaches, because that was never our target audience. And so you've muttered about coming on a couple of times, so I'm glad we finally got round to it.
Well, I'm glad to be on it. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I listen to all kinds of different podcasts, so you're on the list, definitely. I'm glad you're making it work, and you've got a great podcast, and I'm honored to be a part of it. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. And next time we're in Ottawa, we will definitely come and say the name of the museum again.
Canadian Museum of Nature.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Please come. You're invited, one and all.
And do you have any like Blue Sky or Twitter or Facebook or anything handles? Does the museum have one that everybody can follow as well? Because that would be really useful.
Yeah, the museum has they're on X and they're on Instagram, and probably not TikTok. They're on Facebook. I don't even know.
We will
what
link some of them in our show notes.
I'm on X at Jordan_Mallon. I don't use it a whole lot, but I'm on there. That's probably about it. You know what I've taken lately to encouraging people, if they want to reach out to me, send me an email, jmallon@nature.ca. I love getting emails from people like that. So that's the best way to
start forwarding them over. That'll put you off.
No,
amazing.
That sort of one-on-one, you're not performing in front of a crowd. You can have a one-on-one interaction. That's how the world works best, I think. So if you want to reach out to me, you're best to send me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, as you've listened to the show, Jordan, you know that at the end, it's Dave's favourite bit. He insists on doing it every week because he loves it so much, which is we say goodbye in the style of our favourite dinosaur. You might want to do a Gryposaurus or something like that. I will obviously do a pterosaur like Pteranodon because I get to squawk. And Dave will basically slowly collapse into his own face. So after 3, we say goodbye to everybody. Goodbye, go 1, 2, 3. Thank you for listening to this episode of Terrible Lizards, and thanks as well for going to that social media you never seem to update and sharing the podcast there too. You could also go to patreon.com/Terrible Lizards to support the show and access a wealth of extra content. Get in touch with us via terriblelizardspod@gmail.com, and while you're here, do check out Dave and Izzy's books. Flappy bye-bye.